This podcast is recorded on stolen and unceded Aboriginal land.
We acknowledge the First Nations and elders of this country and join their calls for justice. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land.
Very cool. Very dangerous. It's serious danger. Hi, patrons. I'm Emerald. That's Tom Ballard. How you going, Tom?
Hello, Emerald. I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. This is Serious Danger. It's a podcast about green politics in Australia. You already know that, dear patron, because you help make the show possible by chipping in and being a patron. You pay Mike's wages. We love you. He loves you. This show is, of course, produced by the Griff himself, Michael the Griff Griffin. It's not an official Greens Party podcast. It's Inside the Greens time. We're doing the second chapter, or the second half of chapter 6, which is picking fights. We're going to get into the 1998 Tasmanian and federal elections. We're talking GST. We're talking Pauline Hanson. We're talking being painted as like the party of protest still, and more preference drama as we kind of struggle with some growing pains with the Australian Greens. And perhaps most interestingly, some more soul searching. We have like focus groups and election reviews where we really give ourselves some tough love, some tough talk. Before we get into the next chapter, which is where things start to finally turn around. Spoiler. Before we get into it, just very quickly, if you haven't got your tickets for the live shows in New South Wales coming up in about a month, less than a month now, they're selling very, very quickly. I think we've still got a few tickets left in each location. We're at Newcastle Saturday the 23rd, and we are in Sydney Sunday the 24th. But they're selling fast, aren't they, Tom?
They sure are, yes. I am confidently predicting that all the Newcastle tickets will be gone by the time you're listening to this. Sorry, Newcastle, if you didn't get in, but thank you so much to everyone who bought tickets. Sydney, I reckon there's probably still a little bit of room, but I'd get into it. We still haven't announced the guests for these shows. We haven't confirmed them yet, but we will announce them, and then everyone's going to buy tickets. And it's going to be fun.
They're going to be good though. And anyway, we're going to be great. We're going to be great either way because we're your hosts who you know and love. All right, let's make content. Now, as is tradition, it's an Inside the Greens episode for the unacquainted, for the uninitiated. We are reading Paddy Manning's book, Inside the Greens. We're going through chapter by chapter, sometimes half a chapter at a time, as is the case in this instance. A couple of Patreon episodes ago, we started chapter 6. Picking Fights is the name of the chapter. Do you remember what we discussed, Tom, without looking at the show notes? If you don't, I'll just tell you.
I do remember us talking about, Port Arthur definitely happened. I do remember that.
Yep.
And what were we doing? Oh, yes, a lot of environmental stuff. Kyoto was a big topic of conversation. It was, the first half of the chapter was sort of in between the 1996 and 1998 election, right? Or was it, starting at the first, it was starting at the Howard term, right? The first chunk of the Howard government from 96.
There was a fair bit going on. Yes, I thought the tidbit about...
Oh, and of course, Scott Ludlam's incredible play.
Scott Ludlam, that's right, Atomic Oz. So it was like Christine Milne pushing for gun control before it even happened, Scott Ludlam, baby Scott Ludlam, and his mum showing up to the Jabiluka uranium mining protests, and he did a comic about it called Atomic Oz, which Mike lovingly uncovered and posted on the Patreon for all of you to go and have a squiz. You can find out there if you haven't seen that already. We also had Bob Brown's in Parliament giving his first speech. Unfortunately, at the same time, so is Pauline Hanson in the lower house while Bob is in the Senate. So everyone kind of ignored Bob and was listening to Pauline Hanson boo. We had this 10-year strategy report that found that the Greens, which found that, quote, the values-based movements of the previous 25 years, environmental, peace, feminist, gay, and so on, would only ever provide a support base of 10 to 15% of voters. I really liked that line. And this is where we decided
yada, gay, blah,
gay,
blah, blah.
feminist, peace. So we need to start talking about jobs. We're going to start talking about jobs. The Kyoto conference happened. The Libs got us a special quote-unquote Australia clause where land not being cleared counted towards our emissions targets. We got permission to increase emissions anyway, one of the few countries that did. Really good stuff. And there was the Maritime Union's waterfront dispute as well, and a young Sarah Hanson-Young being there helping out, and Bob Brown also offering support, some early support from the union movement from the Greens. So fair bit, but there's still more to come, my dear friends. So
there's even more?
So we pick up second half of chapter 6. It is 1998, the year of the Tasmanian and the federal elections. And in a period where the Greens should be growing, it seemed like we maybe start to kind of go backwards. We have a little bit of a shit year, I would say, after the growths of 1982 to 96. So Tasmania election, first of all, I think we mentioned this in previous chapters, that Labor and the Liberals were like, fuck, these Greens are getting a little bit too much ground. We need to do something to stop this. They team up to reduce the number of seats in Parliament, which means the quota goes up pretty openly in an attempt to stop the Greens. Inside the Greens, it says that Christine Milne said when the laws passed, she went back to her office and cried because she knew it was, quote, over for the Greens.
Oh.
Very sad. It would have just been devastating, like the majors just teaming up to just be like, yeah, we're just going to gerrymander you out. That's our solution.
Just the total act of bastardry. I mean, yeah, we talked about this a lot on the show earlier this year because the Tasmanian state election, that was this year, right, from memory?
Yes.
And yes, and that was when they were finally correcting this terrible decision from the late 90s, actually expanding democracy and recognizing that you need more than fucking two people to run a government in Tasmania, and everyone having a million portfolios is a terrible idea. But yeah, it was fascinating to read about this original decision when the act of bastardry was introduced. And it just seemed so blatant too. They weren't even trying to cover up what they were doing. They were like, no crossbench, thank you, majors only.
Yeah. Peg Putt, who was Bob Brown's successor, was the sole survivor. She held on to the one seat for the Greens. And in fact, it says in the book that she literally brought a folding picnic chair into Parliament when it recommenced after the election and sat it in the middle where the crossbench used to be. And she hung onto that chair. It was later auctioned to writer Richard Flanagan, who presumably still has the chair that Peg Putt went and sat on that was the crossbench.
Well, I think it said that doesn't Christine Milne treasure the chair? Maybe Richard Flanagan got it and then he gave it to Christine Milne.
Maybe I misread this.
Anyway, she treasures it in some ways.
Yeah.
I think Flanagan picked it up as a piece of Tasmanian history, and Christine Milne hangs on to it to this very day and holds it as she cries herself to sleep.
Yes, blah, blah, blah. Milne treasures the chair, which was later picked up by author Richard Flanagan at an auction to this day. Yeah. That's the literal, that is the crossbench in a way. That was the crossbench, is that chair. I did think that this was like a little bit dramatic, but I can imagine when you had been fucked over this badly, this is how you would be feeling. It said, Paddy Manning writes, in her memoir, Milne records that as she walked to the tally room to concede defeat on election night, she told her advisors to go ahead and tell the Greens who were there to meet her that they should, quote, not approach me, embrace me, or make eye contact until after my speech. Kindness would have been my undoing. They did as I asked, and I gave one of the most memorable speeches of my life, predicting that the Greens would be back. A little bit funny though, just to be like, don't look at me, don't touch me. I will fucking cry.
But I found that quite sweet, really. That's her saying she was so emotionally fragile, and she knew that if her comrades showed her some kindness, that'd be it for her, and she'd choke up. I mean, look, I did really feel, politics is hard enough, and it's hard being on the fucking left, and we're used to losing, and losing when everything's fair is hard enough, right? But when you actually have these kind of blatant structural moves to just seriously just freeze you out because you're becoming too popular and too successful, and you have the temerity to not be in the two major parties and get some political success, and then to just have them rig the game against you, it must be kind of brutal. So
Yeah.
I'd probably be the same as Christine Mount. I'd be telling people, like, I just can't right now. I can't even.
I can't. No, I know. It sounds very funny, like, and it sounds almost diva-ish, but I can actually relate. And it is so much that thing that, sometimes you're just in a particular state where as soon as someone is like, puts their hand on the shoulder or is like, or goes to hug you or ask if you're okay, it's fucking over. And so if you had to give the speech that was meant to be like, yes, I know we've been crushed by the political establishment, but we will be back, you would need like no contact until after that. I'm sure she did break down afterwards, after her speech, perhaps. Who knows?
I was thinking about this with the ACT election that happened recently at the time of recording, when the Liberals, like Elizabeth Lee, who gave the finger in that classic moment, just her speech that she has to give to the Liberals losing again after the party loses their 7th consecutive election. Like, what the fuck do you say? I know they're evil Tories and who cares. But what do you even say to a room full of people who have just campaigned like crazy and have been in opposition for 7 terms? Tough gig.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I almost wonder if it would be easier. I've been thinking about this because this is going to be coming out after the Queensland election, but we're actually recording it before. And the fact that, like, in previous elections for the Greens, particularly in Queensland, the election's not even really about us, right? It's not like we're like expecting to win much. And it's kind of easier then to be at that election party, to be on election night when you don't have the intense weight of hope and expectation. So I feel as though, the Canberra Liberals are almost as irrelevant, right? Like, yeah. So the party is gearing up for the federal election after the Tasmanian election happens. One of the things that they did in this kind of space between 1996 and 1998, they held focus groups for the first time. I thought this was really interesting in a number of ways. First of all, they held these focus groups only with committed Green supporters and potential Green/Democrat supporters, only in Hobart and Melbourne, and only 18 to 30-year-olds. So like a very kind of confined small group. I mean, what's the logic there of just really honing in on your existing supporter base, really, do you think?
Well, I read it as sort of potentials, really. I mean, again, with the Greens sort of still so nascent, still polling around 4%, they were also talking, they just need to find the people that, the easy demographics that should be voting Greens that aren't at the moment, as opposed to where we're at the moment, where we're really trying to ask these big questions about how to expand our votes into places and demographics and peoples that would never consider voting Greens whatsoever. I mean, at this point, as it says in the chapter, they're still just trying to get name recognition, just an awareness that the Greens exist, that they are an option, and they're a serious political party. So I think that's there. I think also these, the reach of these polling would also say something to capacity, right? Like just how much money they have and energy and resources to dedicate to actually doing this kind of research. They're probably at their strongest at this stage in Hobart, in Tassie and Victoria. So, it kind of makes sense. But, it's important to put that disclaimer around just how limited this research was.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, I also wondered if it was more it was like an identity kind of like a defining, trying to figure out who we are right now as a base from then where do we go from here? Like who are our supporters? Why are they our supporters? Is maybe a helpful exercise for a new party like this. But the feedback that they get even from these kind of notional supporters, only 18 to 30-year-olds and like people who were committed or could potentially vote for them or the Democrats, they still had some quite interesting input. So the top issues that they identified were unemployment, education, and privatization, with environmental issues only being a secondary kind of concern. Was that surprising to you?
Well, no, I mean, I think that's probably representative of how young people were feeling in the late 90s. And indeed, obviously, there's lots of parallels that now. I mean, in that term, privatization would have been really top of mind because Howard would have done his half sale of Telstra in that first term, I believe. So that's probably front of mind. And, yes, you've had in the early 90s Qantas and Commonwealth as well, Commonwealth Bank rather, being privatized by the Keating government. So that sort of might give an explanation as to why that was sort of front of mind. And the 90s was still not a great, at this point, not a great economic time. The recessions of of the early 90s were probably still very much front of mind, and the economy probably still hadn't quite bounced back, and the mining boom certainly hadn't kicked in yet. So yeah, it sort of makes sense that those issues were there front of mind, and the climate crisis is not biting as much as it will in a couple of years' time, I suppose.
Well, recall as well from the last, maybe it was the first half of the chapter, I think, that they found after the 1996 election that 2/3 of Greens voters were under 35, with the highest proportion of very low income voters of any party. And I think it was like a lot of Greens voters are on the dole, basically. So that does somewhat make sense. Like, a lot of them are students, so education would be a big issue, but also unemployment being a big issue does make sense. From this focus group, I want to read this quote from the book, which says, "They also had some frank criticisms of the Greens, who were people of integrity and, quote, about the future, but were also perceived as a single issue party, quote, emotionally charged, utopian, impractical, irrational, narrow, fringe protesters who opposed everything and produced nothing, and who lacked business skills or political nous." Ouch.
Red for filth? Oh my God. I mean,
the library is officially closed. It's a RuPaul reference, everyone.
We get gay culture.
Yeah.
Yeah, we get it. I mean, look, these are criticisms that certainly persist to this day.
Yes. That's what's
lack
terrifying
business
about it.
skills or political nous. Emotionally charged, yeah. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Like, the balance between being utopian in a way, or feeling like you're out of touch with what people think politics can deliver, and actually painting a positive vision of the future and encouraging people to expect more about what our society could provide to them. That's always been a fine balance, I think, for the party and for anyone on the left, to be like, life could be so much better if we did things differently, while also people saying, show your working out, please, because the government's done a lot of shit things for me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I found this obviously very interesting in the particular context and the way that, like, the media and political class are trying to portray the Greens, particularly on fights like housing, where we have the balance of power. The book reads, quote, "A particular test for the Greens was to balance the politics of confrontation, which could be alienating, with the art of compromise and, quote, shady deal making." So I think that, like, what they're getting at here, I mean, and we weren't really in so much of a position at this time where we were, in balance of power and negotiating on legislation, for example, but we were negotiating perhaps on preferences. And there's this, there's this delicate balance between being part of the political establishment and just like the rest of them who are just doing backroom deals and everything to then deliver things and get things done and produce results, or just being on the outer and showing that you will fight for your principles and, stand up for what you believe in, but maybe then not being on the inner enough to produce the results that you want, not being seen as effective, right?
Yeah, which is hard. I mean, it's still true now, and certainly true in the late 90s. The only serious power in the traditional political electoral sense that the Australian Greens had is through parliamentary moves and deal making, even less so than they do now. As you say, preference deals is kind of like the big power, and doing stunts and trying to draw attention to certain issues and giving speeches. I mean, it's all kind of, that's pretty much the only game in town that we had in terms of a movement or a political party at that point. So that's kind of what we could do, you guys.
That's it. Well, yes, until more people vote Green. And unfortunately, there were a number of barriers raised to why people would not vote Greens, including, quote, "They don't care about people like me," or "They consist of hippies and unemployed." There's no point for voting for people who won't ever get into power. It's a wasted vote, really. So one of the biggest problems that seems to have been identified this early on is this idea of a, quote, wasted vote. And people even have a low recognition as well of what the balance of power is, or that the Greens had held it previously at a state level, in Tasmania. They don't really see they don't see the pathway towards the Greens being able to make their policies happen. I think, like, wasted vote has remained a really big barrier to voting Greens that we've identified even in recent years, but I feel as though it's somewhat blunted or it's somewhat less an issue since 2022. I don't know if that's just a Queensland thing though.
Yeah, well, obviously that's breaking down a bit as more and more people are realizing that voting for the major parties doesn't exactly work out great for you. We've got more and more, a third of the electorate now voting for alternatives, for voting for people who are either independents or in minor parties, sort of saying that the system as it exists sucks. So that has to be premised at least on an idea that you're not wasting your vote by voting for someone who might not be able to form government, right? But yes, it's still certainly out there.
Yeah.
But yes, it's important for us to be able to say, no, you should vote for the things that you want and they're good. You know what? I have a memory now of going to the Port Fairy Folk Festival. It could well have been in 1998 or in the late 90s.
What?
And seeing a comedian do a set, and he had a routine, and he said, we should elect the Greens to government just to see what they'd do. Like the idea that would be like you'd punk them, basically. You'd surprise the Greens if you elected them into government. They'd have no idea what the fuck they were doing, which is
you guys should do that. We would hate that.
That's a really stark memory in my head. I'd even thought about it.
That's so funny. Well, and I mean, and this is one of the things that I think one of like the participants in this focus group of potential supporters, 18 to 30-year-olds said was that if they won government, then they would be screwed effectively because they've only got environmental policies. So that was also identifying this problem was that we're just seen as an environmental party, so we couldn't really govern. We're doing some soul searching. We're looking for a slogan for the next election. Apparently 2 campaign slogans tested well. One was rescue the future and the other one was thinking locally, acting globally. Thank fucking God they chose the first one. But
what does it even mean?
Because I'm like, rescue the future. I don't know, but it is so Greens coded. We've had so many future slogans, right? Like, I don't know what other slogans we've had over the years, but like a future for all of us was 2020 Queensland election and then 2022 a federal election, I believe. And of course, there's unfuck the future. Like, I think that there's this whole, that is something that we've tested as the Greens, is differentiating ourselves from the major parties as the party that's like forward looking and for the future and not just for right now.
Yeah. I mean, I'm still on board with it. I don't know. Yeah, do people think a lot about the future?
Rescue the future.
I mean, in moments like these, in cost of living crisis, obviously, people are seriously thinking about the here and now. First and foremost, obviously, they think about the future in terms of whether their kids are going to be okay.
Yeah,
but it's funny. Remember how Turnbull was like, "There's never been a more exciting time to be an Australian." That kind of, he was sort of briefly went for that like positive future vibe, and then they abandoned that pretty quickly in the Morrison era.
I think
it was just like, don't elect Labor; they're communists. They're going to fuck you up.
I think that Labor has also used a better future or a better future for all, even like because it was something that was really similar to a future for all of us. So maybe it's not just the Greens.
Right.
Maybe that's just one of those political sounding, it's a campaign slogan-y word, isn't it? Future, like better and choices and for you, what matters, blah, blah, blah. So we've got a slogan. National Conference ultimately decided on 2 key targets, things that we would be going after in the election campaign. The first was Pauline Hanson. She is new to federal parliament. We chose as the lead Senate candidate in Victoria was a young Gunage woman, Charmaine Clark. She was a prominent anti-racism activist, and she led this they call it black-green, angle and campaign, particularly focusing on, for example, the Jabiluka campaign. She sounded like this idea of like the black Greens first kind of coming to fruition as Pauline Hanson comes on the scene, and we see that we need to position ourselves on the other side to her, right?
I assume we're going after Pauline Hanson because she stole Bob's thunder with her maiden speech. That was probably
exactly. It was fucking
reason.
rude. He was talking, and you shouldn't talk over Bob while he's speaking. And maybe she should shut her mouth next time. It was all misogyny.
Sort of like on reflection now, it's kind of hard to remember. I mean, obviously, Pauline Hanson sucks real bad and was keying into this horrific racist undertone in Australian politics. In the 90s, of course, you got native title legislation when everyone went all out with racism. And yes, particularly against First Nations people, and that would have been bad. I guess it seems odd that a federal national party would zero in on one candidate from Queensland as sort of like their number one target to go against.
Well,
but then, I mean, then there was some like the Queensland election, right? The state election that same year, One Nation got fucking 23% or something and got 11 seats.
Yeah. I don't know if it was this year or very soon afterwards. Like, I think they mention it briefly in the next chapter or towards the end of this chapter that, yes, like One Nation was emerging as a pretty significant political force, particularly in Queensland. And I think as well, it was huge, right? Because her maiden speech, as I recall it, she stood up and said, we're being, quote, swamped by Asians. Like her entire political existence was predicated on, racist foundations. And it seems as though she got exactly what she wanted, which was being a huge lightning rod for the political kind of, political discussion at that time. And I can imagine that, all the media, all the news at the time would have been talking a lot about Pauline Hanson. And so you look at that and go, this is a big issue. And this is where we stand on it. I mean, the other big issue, of course, so the first target that we go to the election saying we're going to fight this is we're going to fight the rise of Pauline Hanson and her racism. The second is the GST, which is like people call the 1998 election, the GST election. This was after Howard had previously kind of proposed GST and then said there will never be a GST. And then he brought it back after the 1998 election. Were you old enough to remember the GST debate happening and like it ultimately being introduced?
No, it took me a very long time for me to figure out exactly what the fuck GST was and how it worked. I remember hearing about it vaguely in the news. That's pretty much it. But it seemed, too complicated for me. I didn't know. I think it probably took me a while to figure out what GST actually stood for as well. So I wasn't following closely at the time. Had a look at it in depth for my little book a couple of years ago, trying to research it and the history of it. And it's truly cooked. I mean, I think we've discussed the downsides of a regressive consumption tax like this before.
Regressive consumption tax, yeah. Yeah, I mean, weirdly, I swear, and this could be one of those kind of false memories where I think that I remember this even though I would have been really young, but I do feel as though I had a memory of being in Mallams, the local supermarket that was ultimately bought out by Woolies in Mullumbimby, where I got my first job as well. But like being in Mallams and being aware of discussions about the fact that, everything now had GST, everything now had 10% added onto it. I sort of vaguely remember that being a thing as it was rolled out. Obviously, yes, the GST was a huge issue. Howard proposed it ahead of the election. Weeks out from election day, the Democrats' leader signaled support for it. I don't know if the book gets into this or if we have got into this a whole lot on the show, but as I understand it, that the GST, like the Democrats ultimately supporting the GST in exchange for some concessions around it not including like fresh food, for example, and some services. That was the beginning of the end for the Democrats, right? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, they sort of made it their big thing is that we will not support the GST, and then they totally supported the GST because that's great. That's having adults in the room.
The GST, they allowed it to go ahead.
Yeah, it's great, and it's so insane that they got those concessions. The idea that there would have been GST on fresh food and health and education, and people still want to introduce that same tax onto those services and things now. Like they think it's awesome. They should bring it back. I think. Did we talk about it with my book? The guy who like pioneered the policy at the ATO has license plates called with Mr. GST on them. Do you remember that little nugget from my book?
No. Oh God, I forgot that. That's so fucked because it's like, it seems that it was a very unpopular policy, which is funny though because when I have to say, growing up, like I said, I became aware of this becoming a thing, but then I also, when I learned about, for example, how in America you go state to state and you have to like add all these different taxes onto your fucking groceries when you're buying them because you have no idea how much you're going to end up paying for something. And so in my head I was like, wow, Australia is a lot better than this. It just says on the label how much it is and it's 10%. It's super easy. But there is an alternative, which is that we could not have that and actually tax wealth instead of consumption. But that's beside the point. The Greens, of course, they were opposed to the GST, but Paddy Manning says in Inside the Greens that they struggled for attention on it. And I wonder if that's because I feel like their take on it was a bit weird. So apparently Bob Brown's initially, his angle was that the GST is, quote, anti-green because it, and I'm quoting from the book, would increase the price of organic fruit and vegetables but lower the price of pesticides and diesel.
No, Bob. No, Bob. These are not the greatest crimes of the GST. Come on, buddy.
Not the pesticides being cheaper. Like, it's very 90s green, isn't it? Yeah, not sure how we struggled to get issue ownership over that one. Instead, as the election rolled on, it seemed like Bob Brown was becoming more known or more attacked for being associated with protests. So he was being painted as the guy that just does stunts and protests instead of doing his damn job as a senator. He was arrested at an anti-logging protest in East Gippsland. Is it Gippsland or Gippsland? I always forget. It's Gippsland, isn't it?
Gippsland, yeah. Or Gippsland.
Gippsland, thank you.
You want to go for Aussie,
Gippsland, sorry. East Gippsland. Those charges were later thrown out. He appeared at what sounds like a fairly intense anti-logging protest. It sounds like things got a bit heated. Some people got jostled, including, I believe, Howard and his wife. There was because the crowd was pushing, a reporter got pushed onto a baby in a pram, not ideal. But Bob Brown was there. He blocked the Prime Minister's car and, yes, was protesting logging. Apparently also, the book says that a costumed quoll, so someone dressed up as a quoll, which I guess lived in the forest, quote, threw herself under the wheels of the Commonwealth car yelling, "Howard, you rapist," which I feel like we don't really do the whole "you're raping the forests" thing anymore, do we? I feel like it's a little bit poor taste.
It's a little bit. You're me tooing the forest. Yeah, we don't really do it so much.
Yeah.
Wow, I mean, it's so good we've moved on, isn't it? Like now these days, people wouldn't get outraged by a senator, doing some kind of protest and drawing attention to an important issue by doing something a little bit of a stunty, even though that would attract a lot of media attention and sort of do exactly what the protest is supposed to do. It's good.
No, this is no longer an effective. Yeah, this will no longer take up headlines for an entire week, for example, with everyone having their own fucking takes on whether someone is doing their job if they go to a protest or speak up about what they believe in or what they were elected on. No. But unfortunately, we are being sarcastic. The other thing that's very deja vu about this and what is kind of described in this chapter is the way that the Greens then, because Bob Brown is at protests or he's getting arrested and they have this, they do participate in protests, unlike a lot of other politicians, they are then blamed for any and all protests and everything that happens at protests. For example, to Molotov cocktails getting thrown through the window of an Energy Resources Australia office, or an anti-Jabaluka protester who apparently chained himself to the office of a Nationals MP and threatened to blow himself up.
Jesus.
So even though Bob Brown and the Greens would come out and say, we support peaceful protest, we don't support violence, these are not, these actions are not endorsed by us, blah, 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 it's still, the Greens are painted with the same brush and painted as violent and dangerous protesters.
Great stuff. Do Labor people do they like any protest? I was trying to think, what is a protest of any description that the Labor Party, electoral figures, have ever sort of would lend their support to or go along to actually support?
They go to rallies sometimes.
Yeah, right. Generic union rallies, I reckon, probably.
Union rallies. I reckon some MPs might go to a climate rally that's just like they would go to a climate strike, for example. Some Labor MPs went to the climate strikes when the kids were organising it, but only if it's at lunchtime and it's sanctioned, or some of the left faction ones, or they'll go to Labor Day rallies, or they would go to women's rights rallies, like the ones in 2022. What were they called?
Oh, right, the around Brittany Higgins's case.
Yes, there was a slogan, there was a name that they were called. But anyway, they go to those, or they would go to pro-choice rallies. But it's not really ever protesting anything in particular. It's usually just we've got a permit to march down this road. Here we are with our unions.
Right, going to a rally is a different. I mean, yeah, I guess, yeah. When they're the government, I guess they're never going to sort of get involved in the same way. I feel like when they're in opposition, they're much more likely to do that. But yeah, Jesus, they're never happy. These people.
No, never happy. Of course, I'm sure this would be a criticism sometimes of, Greens attending protests, but then the focus throughout the election campaign is more on Bob Brown being a naughty protester rather than any of the policy announcements. Like, for example, Paddy Manning says that the Greens launched a policy proposal for a $25 a tonne carbon price, but it got pretty much no coverage, even though, that would be, if you look at it historically speaking, a fairly significant policy intervention. Unfortunately, yes, I feel as though we do, as we say, as the Greens get more seats, as we gain power, as the movement grows, we get a little bit more media coverage, but it is still guaranteed that you will get far more coverage from the fact that you've attended a protest than any policy announcement.
Yeah, interesting. Although, I mean, I guess Max has really been at the nexus of two of those things recently. I mean, I think his policy agenda and the kind of policies they get out there get a lot of attention. That's because of our increasing electoral power and the way that we're cutting through. Yeah. And then, he attends a rally perfectly legitimately to stand up for union democracy and is pilloried. I mean. Yeah, I say do all of it all the time as much as possible, as long as it aligns with your principles.
Yeah.
That's sort of all you can do. It was interesting when Bob Brown was being criticized at the time. He's saying explicitly, he's like, my speeches in Parliament do not get any coverage. This is what gets coverage. This shows that I'm dedicated.
Yeah, that's
and I'm
right. He wrote a letter to the Australian saying this.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So it's that's an interesting sort of angle, I suppose, or a justification for it. That's probably pretty fair enough, I think.
It didn't say in the book whether they printed his letter. I don't know if this is just something that they then found out, Paddy Manning found out by asking Bob Brown if he sent the letter in, because this is the thing. It would be funny to know whether that was actually printed, because now we just expect it. Of course they never cover our fucking policies. They'll, the ABC will put out there what are the parties offering stories and completely ignore or misrepresent the Greens policies until corrected, but or just be all the Greens do is protest. But if we sent in a letter to any media outlets, if one of our MPs was like, but you're not reporting on my speeches, they would be like, cool, thanks for the letter. I don't think they would run it. I very much doubt it.
Appreciate your feedback. Your feedback is important to us, Bob Brown.
Yeah. Please stay on the line. Well, unfortunately, the results were not so good for us. The election results for the Greens, we got 2.7% in the Senate and 2.6% in the lower house. Our highest vote across the country in the lower house was 9.4% in Newcastle, which I thought was somewhat interesting and just a curious little tidbit. Some people say Newcastle is the next, what's the word? Next forefront, the next something for the Greens. Frontier, that's it.
Mm-hmm.
So that was interesting to know. Somehow, though, the Democrats still got 8.4% and 9 senators, which meant that they had the balance of power in the Senate, which they would use to do stupid things. Even despite, as we discussed earlier in the chapter, Cheryl Kernow's defection and their support for the GST. They still really smashed us electorally.
I mean, they still hung around for a while, right? Because you've still got the Natasha Stott-Despoja era as well, which must have been well into the early 2000s. I think that she was still the leader and sort of doing stuff as part of the party. So they were around for a while. But I mean, it's pretty fundamental stuff. It's like the Liberal Democrats in the UK. They were like, we are against tuition fees, then went into coalition with the Tories and immediately jacked up tuition fees. The one policy was scrapping tuition fees, and then they increased them, and people were like, you guys suck and you don't believe in anything.
Wild. Yeah, I mean, and it seems as though, reading ahead a little bit into the next chapter, that the kind of next era after this election for the Greens is largely about, I guess, taking on the Democrats or trying to take over the space that the Democrats are occupying in Australian politics at the time. But at this point, they are very much overshadowing us, and that switch hasn't really been flipped yet. So we go back home with our tail between our legs and do some more soul searching and some more reflecting. We did an election review where we said point blank that the party had failed to achieve our goals. We wanted to increase our vote, increase our representation. We failed on those fronts. One of the main issues seemed to be that there was, quote, no national political strategy. So I think we were still struggling a little bit with a unified Australian Greens party. Some of the states were kind of like doing their own thing, or there was difficulty communicating between the states and getting on the same page and really organising a proper national political movement after we'd federated.
Well, yeah, we still don't have WA Greens yet, right? Like WA Greens are still a separate party, and
Yes.
Dee Margetts is the senator who was going for re-election. Still technically wasn't an Australian Greens senator, and she lost. She lost out to the Democrats, so we lost that that extra Senate place, and the extra Senate seat we were hoping for in Tasmania also didn't happen. But yes, still not an actually federal party with the Australian Greens, and then mainly because for those two parties to unite, they'd have to put the constitutions together, and that would require all the state branches to agree on stuff,
and that was
wasn't
very
happening.
hard.
Yes,
you can just imagine the meetings and the consensus making. We all love consensus in the Greens, but that would have been fucking horrible. Yeah. Another example, though, of like this national strategy kind of being a missing piece is that preferences are obviously still such a big factor, and the Greens had said. They made this decision, right? We're going after One Nation. We're positioning ourselves in opposition to One Nation. They'd come out and said, we are going to put One Nation last on our how to vote cards. We're going to preference them last. But the Northern Territory Greens just like didn't get the memo or something.
Yeah.
And they didn't put One Nation last. They put the Country Liberals last instead. Oops. And so that then meant that because we didn't have this consistent approach to putting One Nation last, we also missed out on preferences from this anti-racist party at the time, the Unity Party, which the review said, well, that probably also was a Labor front that ended up costing us all this money because they ran against us and they kept our primary vote below the 4% reimbursement threshold. So we would have got tens of thousands more dollars in a bunch of these seats because we would have got above 4%. If that party didn't end up running against us. So, I mean, partly probably an attack from the major parties setting up front groups, but partly also an issue where we couldn't unify together across the country for an effective strategy, even on one of two like key political objectives or kind of strategic objectives that we'd set for the campaign.
God damn it. Damn our racism.
Yes. That's right. Speaking of racism, I mean, we still, at this point, we'd spoken in previous chapters about the fucking Queensland Greens, for example, preferencing the coalition over Labor. Apparently, we still preference the coalition over Labor in 6 out of 66 marginal seats, but there was a clear trend towards us more consistently preferencing Labor ahead of the coalition. The election review recommended this like 5-point strategy for future campaigns that seemed to be mostly about preferences. It included, for example, dealing more with the Democrats, trying to do preference deals with the Democrats, putting the ALP over the coalition consistently and putting One Nation last consistently. It also found it identified this trend that it's much harder for the Greens to win votes off the major parties when the Liberals are in power because people are like, fuck this Liberal government, I want to get them out, and they tend to go back towards the ALP. And I thought this was interesting because I was kind of reflecting on what we were expecting in 2022 in the federal election, and that was based on this trend which had kind of held tight historically where people don't want to vote Greens. They don't want to risk the Greens. They just want to make sure that we kick the Libs out. So they vote ALP, whereas in 2022, we managed to actually buck that trend and grow the Greens representation even at a change of government election where people were desperate to get the Libs out. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it was a truism that held for a long time. 2022 went the other way. I mean, 2022 represented the end of of what, 9 years of coalition government. I mean, I think the thing to keep in mind with 1998, that is the first term government. Like Labor had been in power since 1983 beforehand. Howard had just gotten in 1996. Then just 2 years later, they're having another federal election. So after just one term. So it would be remarkable, like really remarkable if there was a change of government at that point. So it was always kind of an uphill battle. But yes, certainly that's that seems to be the vibe. Anyone who was really desperate for a Labor government probably would have been voting them, would have gone to them rather than the Greens, for sure.
Yeah. The other interesting thing that the election review found or recommended was explicitly like, don't bother with the environmental NGOs anymore. Don't bother with the environment movement. They fucking betrayed us. They don't do shit for us, even though we do everything right. They keep fucking letting us down. So the review said, quote, our recommendation to the party is that we cease to see relations with the movement in personal or even electoral terms. They are dead to us. Dead.
God damn.
You think this is like a bit of petulance, or is it just smart?
Well, I mean, look, we've talked at length on the show about the frustrations with these peak groups and their failure to get on board the fucking green train, toot toot, even though we are correct on every issue and we are their best vehicle for electoral change. And that frustration still persists to this day. It seems a shame that there can't be more of a productive relationship between the Greens and the environmental movement, but in the broader project of trying to get people to realize that the environment is in crisis because of capitalism, like because of the economic system under which we live, and like you really need to go for that in order to seriously do something about the environment. Yes, you have to. That takes a lot of convincing, particularly if you're talking to, well, let's call them what they are, tree Tories in a lot of instances.
Yes. Yeah, no, we were like, no more enviro NGOs. We're done with them. There was around this period, though, it seems like, and we've kind of discussed this a little bit, there was more of a concerted effort in courting the unions, like getting support from the unions. The unions had donated $4,200 to the Greens in this election, which doesn't sound like much, but it was out of a total donation chest of $10,000. So, like, pretty significantly, I guess you could say that the campaign was funded by unions in large part. Charmaine Clarke, that lead Victorian Senate candidate, had said during the campaign, quote, we are more Labor than Labor. That was Labor with a U and then Labor like the party. The Greens are the only party in Parliament radical enough to have the right to strike in our policy. So there's clearly this like early trying to position ourselves as aligned with, the Labor movement and the union movement. And I wonder if, I guess there was this sort of like inflection point before the Greens really started threatening Labor and the Labor machine was really turned on the Greens and the unions kind of like brought into line to stay where they fucking belong with the Labor Party, where the Greens could have scooped up that union support that really policy-wise they deserve.
Yeah, gosh. I mean, it sounds like it. Again, we seem to have been on the right side of Howard's initial IR reforms, which were terrible and went pretty hard on them as well, which is what sort of got the attention from the union movement. I mean, certainly on the fight against work choices, the Greens were there and part of that fight, but Labor really took up that mantle. And there's been lots of instances when the Labor Party has like noticed that someone like the ETU has been giving shitloads of money to someone like Adam or the Greens generally and done what they can to court them back to the cause to get on board and be part of the big Labor ACTU family. So they're certainly conscious of it. But it's I don't know. It's still great to know that even from more than 25 years ago, Labor Greens were still conscious of and talking about workers' rights, and that was a big part of their policies. And we had a cool candidate who was happy to talk about that.
Yeah. So the chapter finishes by saying this, and I'll read out the full quote because I think it's quite good. He says, after 5 years as a confederation in which it had contested 3 elections, at the end of 1998, the Australian Greens were little stronger than they'd been at the beginning. They had 1 senator, had been almost wiped out in their home state of Tasmania, were estranged from the environmental movement, had burned their bridges with Labor, and their primary vote was falling. Womp womp. The next election, when Bob Brown's Senate term was up, would be do or die for the party. Despite the gloomy situation, the review reached an eerily prescient conclusion about the party's prospects at the next election. It said, quote, we could have an early onset of the next wave of environmentalism, or perhaps an equivalent future angst in the form of millennial anxiety. In this situation, Bob Brown would shine as the most credible politician in Australia on the big picture millennial angst questions and could plausibly carry the Greens to a surge of support, say 4 to 4.5%. Paddy Manning says, which is exactly what happened. Although, of course, nobody could know it yet. Little teaser, sizzle.
Little tease. We should clarify the millennial there in that context is not like the generation of millennials. It is like the concept of being around the turn of the millennium and the concept that we're entering the 21st century.
And that all the computers are going to fail because they don't know how to display the date 2000 and the world's going to blow up, right?
You know, the real story with that is that like people did actually work very hard to make sure that nothing bad happened. Like there was actually a concerted effort and there was a genuine problem there. It's just that it wasn't what everyone thought it would be.
Do you reckon that everything would have blown up if they hadn't done that, or was that just being cautious?
Everything wasn't going to blow up, but there was like an actual serious computing problem that shitloads of people spent a lot of time and effort trying to resolve ahead of the millennium. It was actually like
it might have just been like annoying to, you would have like had trouble logging in to your computer on Monday morning or something.
Yeah, you couldn't use MSN Messenger or whatever. Yeah, it would have been pretty bad.
Yeah, I don't think that was around in 2000, but. Well, look, so yes, we're down in the dumps, but we've got glimmers of hope on the horizon, which we get to in the next chapter. When we return for the next installment of Inside the Greens, we'll be reading chapter 7, which is called Turning the Corner, hopefully named. And it gets into how the Greens, started to build themselves back up after this slump of the 1998 elections, really based on this growth from the grassroots up in New South Wales and Victoria, and particularly these council gains in those states kind of setting the foundation for future wins, which was in contrast a bit to the way that the party had operated previously, where it was kind of top down in a way in Tasmania and WA, for example. It gets into, for one example, in New South Wales, Lee Rhiannon running for the New South Wales state election as the lead Greens candidate. Very interesting. I'm excited to talk about Lee Rhiannon. It gets into the international Greens movement growing and the formation of the Global Greens, their first conference. It talks about the WA and Queensland elections and how, inching towards outpolling the Democrats. And the first show of cracks between the Australian Greens and the New South Wales Greens, including perhaps presciently over private school funding. Ding, ding, ding. And then we get into the 2001 election and, the refugee crisis, the Tampa crisis, and the Greens really kind of being positioned as the party standing up for refugees in that period, and then leading into the quote-unquote war on terror. So much to discuss. Much to discuss.
Look forward to that. Thank you very much for prepping this episode, and thank you very much to Paddy Manning for writing Inside the Greens. And thank you for being a patron. Remember, you can always rate and review our show on Apple Podcasts, wherever you're listening. Like and subscribe on YouTube, please, and follow us on socials at Serious Danger AU. Anytime you want to message us through Patreon, we're very happy to hear your feedback of all kinds. We love you very much, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye. Love you.
Serious Danger Australia.